If you will, open up your Bibles this evening to Genesis chapter 1. We'll begin there in a moment, Genesis chapter 1. I was not able to sing this evening. Mike could have tried, but last Wednesday I got sick and lost my voice. I wasn't able to preach or go to church Sunday. My voice finally started coming back Wednesday, and this is the best it has been. I can't promise you it's going to hold up through the sermon tonight, especially when I look at the number of pages of notes I have to go through. But we're going to do the best that we can together to get through this, and hopefully my voice holds out. I want to say thank you to the church for having me this evening. I know that you invited me to speak because Holly would be here and our baby Micah would be here, but neither of them are here tonight because one of our kids is at home not feeling well, and she did not trust me to bring Micah with me by myself. As if there's not a church full of people who would love to have held him the whole time, but still, I was not allowed to bring him with me. So, and I understand why, and I get it, but I know y'all would have liked to have seen them. Some of you have known Holly for many, many years, and of course, Micah's cute as a button. So I do have two of my kids here, Elijah, who is sitting in the second row. My dad came with me this evening. He's sitting on the front, and Emmy's sitting back there in a colorful striped dress. So I'm glad that they are able to be here. So appreciate your interest in the subject this evening. I find it fascinating that I was asked for, a sermon topic, and I sent probably 5 or 6. And I was told, hey, why don't you do the problems with evolution sermon? Which actually, when I sent the list, did not even exist. It's just something I threw out there. I didn't have a lesson specifically on that. And when I finally got all the topics, I understood why. Every single one of the lessons that I suggested could do had something to do with suffering and dying. And I think every single one of your lessons this week has been on suffering and dying. And so you have suffered enough. We're not going to talk about suffering tonight, but you will have to suffer through a sermon that is very much like sitting in science class. I want you to imagine this evening for just a moment that you have been charged with a crime. If you get pulled over by the police, they need to have reasonable suspicion. They need to be able to articulate the cause for pulling you over. If they can't, they're not allowed to do it. And so you get out scot-free if they can't. But they got to have a reason to pull you over. So let's imagine for a moment you've been accused of a crime, maybe a big white-collar crime, embezzlement of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you didn't do it, and you know you didn't do it. And they interview some people, they bring in some witnesses, they talk about why they believe you did it, but at the end of the day, you're sitting there in court trying to figure out, how did I get here? Because there's been absolutely no evidence brought against me. There's been no evidence that says this is what I did. And the jury goes out to deliberate, and within 5 minutes they come back and they say, guilty on all counts. And your heart and your stomach just sinks. And you're like, how did this happen? There's no evidence to convict me of the crime. In a very real sense, that's what we're going to be dealing with this evening as we talk about evolution. I do believe that there are reasons why some people choose to believe in evolution instead of creation. However, as you begin to examine the evidence is just lacking. It's problematic. It is filled with logical fallacies and assumptions and many, many problems. But what evolutionists want you to do is they want you to think that as Christians you have a blind faith. That you believe in God despite all of the evidence around you. They want you to think that you have to either accept science or accept faith, but you can't really believe in science and believe in the Bible at the same time because they oppose each other, even though that's not true. They want to paint Christians as an unreasonably minded people who refuse to look at real evidence. They want us to accept evolution as settled fact instead of theory. But what I want us to see this evening is that there are a lot of problems with evolution. While we're not going to talk about all the reasons why I believe in God and the Bible as His Word, what I want us to walk away with an understanding is that we can believe in God. We can believe in His Word, and we can know that our faith is real. And that faith in God exists because of the evidence, not in spite of the evidence. and that our faith is reasonable, rational, and logical. And I hope this evening to give you 3 talking points or 3 ideas that you can take away and maybe have conversations with people who maybe don't believe in God. But also hope at the end of the day you'll look at these things and understand that evolution really doesn't have a solid foot or leg to stand on. And it'll strengthen your own faith in God as you walk out the doors this evening. I will say I'm very passionate about this topic. I told Donald tonight, I probably have, I'm guessing, about 30 sermons on creation and evolution. And the reason why is because I grew up, like many people here did, going to church. I probably had a Bible in my crib. If not a Bible, it was a hymnal. And I was in Bible class every single time the doors were open. I knew the answers to the lessons. I had the memory verses down. I could quote Bible verses like crazy. I could name all the judges. I could tell you the kings of Israel, who was good and who was bad. Maybe not anymore, but I could when I was a kid. And I graduated high school, and I did a little bit of college, and I actually started preaching. And somewhere along the line, I started having questions and doubts. If everything that I was taught in school was right, how can the Bible possibly be true? If all of the evidence that is out there is real, how can Genesis 1 be accurate? And even while I was beginning to preach, I began to struggle in my faith. And I started digging. When I started digging, I started learning, and I started growing, and my faith in God was strengthened. And I'll tell you this, I got really angry. And if I get angry at a point in the lesson this evening, it is because I was taught things in school that even back then, Elijah, yes, in the Stone Ages, they knew were wrong, but they taught them anyway as if they were real. And it caused me to struggle in my faith. And I hope this evening we can do things to help build our faith so that others may not have to go through that. So we're going to talk about this evening is the idea of the sticky problems with evolution. From primordial soup to logical goop is what I titled the lesson. I want to begin with the first point, and that is simply this. Well, before I do that, I want to say this. I'm going to say evolution. I need to be very clear because I don't want anybody to kind of argue with this later on. When I say evolution, I am talking about the general theory of evolution. I am not talking about small changes in organisms and creatures that we all admit happen. Okay? I'm not talking about what we often call as microevolution. I'm talking about macro. The evolutionary community mocks at those terms because they're inconvenient for them. But when I talk about evolution, and I say that word, please understand, I'm talking about an amoeba becoming a frog, becoming a monkey, becoming a man. That's what I'm talking about. So I wanted to make that clear. So we're going to begin by talking about the missing evidence in evolution. If evolution is true, and the general theory of evolution explains the existence of everything, you ought to find the evidence for it everywhere. There ought to be markers all over this world for evolution. Darwin himself said geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. Charles Darwin himself, even when he wrote The Origin of the Species, which is ironic because he never explained the origin of the species, Charles Darwin himself admitted the evidence for my theory is not there, but I believe one day it'll be discovered. And we have done a lot of digging, we've done a lot of discoveries, we've done a lot of advancements in science, and we still have not been able to prove that evolution is true. And there's a reason why. The geologic column itself should tell the story of evolution. If you're not familiar with this, you could take the earth and look at it like it's a big piece of pie. Flat earthers would love that. And you take a big piece of pie and you cut a slice out and you look at it, and it's built up in layers. And if evolution is true, you ought to be able to look at the bottom layers and see the simplest, most basic animals and creatures and organisms. And then as you go up layer by layer by layer, you get more and more complex. And you ought to be able to look at the fossil record and watch the general theory of evolution just unfold before your eyes. But that doesn't happen. Instead, we have what people have labeled for years that Cambrian Explosion. They teach it in school. It is a sudden burst of immediately complex life. Richard Dawkins, a leading evolutionist, said the Cambrian strata of rocks about 600 million years ago are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major vertebrate groups. We find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. And he admits this is a problem for evolutionists, and it delights creationists. Richard Dawkins admits that there is a problem with this. The absence of the evidence has led to all sorts of wild and crazy finds. Every time evolutionists discover a fish that looks a little weird, they immediately say, here's the missing link. This fish had fins that it could use as legs, and it could crawl out of the water, and it eventually turned into an amphibian of some sort. Some of these creatures that they have put forward as being the missing links are so easily debunked, it's laughable. I've been corrected on my pronunciation. The coelacanth is just a fish, or one that had fins that you could walk on. They're like, hey, here it is. It's the missing link. And then they later on discover, no, it's just a fish. They don't talk about it after that. The Archaeoraptor was a famous one. It was supposed to be the link between dinosaurs and birds, but it was proven to be a fraud. I want to give you a hint. If you love fossils, please don't ever order a fossil from China. Basically, it's Temu. Everything's fake. They had taken a dinosaur fossilized tail and they glued it onto a fossilized bird, and they said, here's your missing link. We've got a bird with a dinosaur tail. And then they discovered it was fake. That's a problem, isn't it? If dinosaurs turned into birds or vice versa, there ought to be examples out there of many birds with tails that are not fake but very real. I think the most famous quote-unquote missing link that is out there is Lucy. Maybe you love Lucy. I don't know. There's a show about that. But it was discovered in the 1970s. She was thought to have lived about 3.2 million years ago. They say she was 3'6" tall. I don't know how tall my daughter is, but it's got to be pretty close to her, 3'6" and weighed 50 pounds. You're talking about a creature the size of a young child. Several investigators, including Richard Leakey, have now concluded that 2 or perhaps 3 species have been wrongly combined in order to form Lucy. I want to show you this before we move on, if you've never looked at Lucy. Creation Museum up in Kentucky is a great place to go. There's a lot of Calvinism in it. You kind of have to sort through it, but there's a lot of good stuff. And you can look there and you can see the number of bones. I want to ask you this. If you looked at those bones, what could you conclude about what this creature looks like? Now, you might be able to come up with a general body size. I think there's enough there to figure about how tall it was. And you might be able to walk away and figure out a little bit about its body mass, maybe. But what color hair did it have? How much hair did it have? What color skin did it have? What about its facial features? What about its muscle build? You can get a little bit of the muscle build from the bones, but not everything. What about the ears? How big are the ears? Do they stick way out? Are they pointy? Are they really small? How do you know from that little bitty bit of bones? They take those bones and they create this. This is Lucy in their mind. I would say this. This image of Lucy, based upon these bones, is not as much about science as it is about art. Maybe they wanted Lucy to look like this. What if Lucy didn't have any hair at all? What if Lucy was pale skinned instead of dark skinned? What if Lucy's facial features were a little bit different in the way that they were shaped? You could make Lucy look like anything. It's very problematic. Dr. Johansen himself admitted Lucy has been dethroned. The 15 minutes of fame has ended. Lee Berger declared, one might say we're kicking Lucy out of the family tree. It's kind of funny when you look at the family tree of humans according to evolutionists, how often that tree has to get pruned and trimmed. Lucy was simply some type of ape-like, chimpanzee-like creature. Maybe one that is no longer with us. How many animals have gone extinct over the years? But there's no reason based upon the fossils to believe that Lucy was anything but this. Now here's where I started having trouble from what I was taught in school, and I don't know how much the kids are still taught this today, but these were things that were in my textbooks. Yes, we had textbooks back then. But one of the first things that I remember being taught for evolution was this thing called Haeckel's embryo. Haeckel said basically that you could look at the embryonic development of creatures over the course of time, and you could look at these creatures and you could line them up in their embryonic stages, and not only could you tell that, hey, they all look a lot alike, so they must have come from a common ancestor, but he says you can look at it and you can see evolution unfold, meaning you go back to the earliest stages, and that's what the earliest creatures look like, and you develop on out. But there were some major problems with Haeckel's embryos. One of them is that he picked and chose very carefully the embryos that would look the most alike and rejected those that did not look like what he wanted them to. He also faked many of the images. He got tired of doing the research, so he started drawing them the way he wanted them to look. And instead of choosing the early stages, as he said, he actually chose pictures from the middle stages. And everybody knows this about Haeckel. Then there's Darwin's finches. This is probably one of the big bell cows of evolution. Charles Darwin visits the Galapagos Islands, and while he's there, he's observing the birds, and he's watching the climates change. And sometimes you have rainy seasons, sometimes you have dry, sometimes it's hotter, sometimes it's cooler. And he noticed that as the weather changed, the size of the beaks and the birds that he observed also changed. He says, here you have it, proof of evolution. Given enough time, I assume the changes in the beak size would eventually take this bird and maybe make them into a monkey or a zebra or a camel because their beak size changed. I don't know. But that's what he put out there. Did their beak size change? Yes. What does that prove? It proves natural selection and survival of the fittest is real. But does that prove evolution? No. All it proves is that as the food sources changed, the birds with beaks better adapted to that food source that was available would survive and thrive. And the ones whose beaks weren't as suitable for the environment, they would die off or maybe not reproduce as much. If you visit the Galapagos Islands today, you know what you're going to find? Finches. And you know what they are? They're finches. And their beak sizes still today, you'll see some with bigger beaks and some with smaller beaks based upon their food sources. They're still finches. Nothing has changed. Then there's the peppered moss. A guy named Bernard Kettlewell in England in the 1950s published his findings about these moths. And what he would do is he noticed that in this industrialized area where pollution had killed the lichen on the trees, he noticed a change in the population of certain types of moths. Melanic moths are dark colored and peppered moths are light colored. Well, pepper moths blend in really well with the lichen. But when the lichen dies off, they stand out like a sore thumb. What he observed was as the lichen died off, the melanic moths were more plentiful. And the peppered moths became fewer and fewer. And he said, see, here's evolution. This is ridiculous. What did he observe? He observed changes in a population based upon their environmental factors. Moths were not becoming lizards. They were still moths. What was happening is these peppered moths, because they no longer blended in, were getting eaten by a bunch of birds. That was it. And he faked his work. He glued these moths onto the trees and presented them as though they were definitely there. There's been a lot of other things that have been put forward as evidence for evolution. I've got this whale chart on the screen. I don't have time to get into this. If you want to dig into it, you can take a picture with your phone maybe and look at it later. We don't have time for it. But all kinds of things have been put forward. The population of elephants without tusks is growing versus those with tusks. Dogs in Russia learn to navigate the subway system. There's evolution at work, they say. The Hudson River fish are growing immune to toxic waste. Fence lizards are figuring out how to dance to avoid fire ants. Certain lizards introduced to an island gained the ability to eat leaves instead of insects when the insect population diminished. Grizzly and polar bears began to breed. What do you see? You see small changes, yes. You see behavior changes, yes. Population changes, absolutely. But bears are still bears, and dogs are still dogs, and lizards are still lizards, and elephants are still elephants. We have this happen all the time today. I don't understand it. But people pay thousands of dollars for what used to be the neighbor's dog climbed the fence and got in the cage with your dog, and now we got unplanned puppies, and they're mutts, and we give them away for free, and now people pay $2,000 or $3,000. And I get it, some of these designer breeds are kind of cool looking. I want the Bernie Doodle. I think that's a pretty cool looking dog. I want one. But they're expensive, right? But what about a Chiweenie? Absolutely nothing should breed with a weenie dog. It never looks good, right? But we look at this and we're like, is this evolution at work? I mean, one of these looks like a mop. If I'm walking through my house, I pick him up and clean my floors instead of my mop. That's what he looks like. But what are they? They're dogs. And we need to understand this. Every one of these are terrible at being dogs. You may like a toy poodle and you may think it's cute. I want you to know you really have a cat. But if you've got a toy poodle, you've got the furthest thing away from a genuine canine that you can genetically possibly have. They're not better at being dogs. They're genetically worse at being dogs. We see these changes all the time. It's not evolution in the big sense. Some point to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I'm going to hit this really fast, but we got a problem in our medical field where doctors are prescribing antibiotics and people aren't taking them like they're supposed to be taking them, or some people take way too many antibiotics and you get in a hospital situation and these bacteria will grow that are resistant to antibiotics. And it's a real problem for people, isn't it? And they become very, very difficult for us to kill. But what we need to understand is when this happens, what is the bacteria? It's still bacteria. It's not changing into something else. In fact, scientists will tell you that antibiotic-resistant bacteria are worse at being bacteria than regular bacteria are. They're an inferior product, not a superior one. For evolution to be true, the product needs to be getting better, not worse. What happens is the altered protein is less efficient in performing its normal function, making it less fit in an environment without antibiotics. The non-mutant bacteria are better able to compete for resources and reproduce faster than the mutant form. Yes, it's a problem for us, but it's really bad for bacteria. Instead of a tree of life, which Darwin proposed, the fossil record and the evidence that is there reveals more of a lawn. More of a lawn. And that's what any of us would expect to see when we look at creation and we look at the Bible story. When we consider the observable world, the evidence is exactly what we would expect to find if the world was designed and created by God like the book of Genesis teaches. It supports the biblical narrative even beyond Genesis chapter 1. God created the world and God created the universe. How old was it? I love when people argue about young earth and old earth. How old was Adam? How old was Eve? How old were the trees in the Garden of Eden? How old was the planet Earth and the solar system that God created? He created a mature world, a mature universe. And that's exactly what we find when we look at the world around us. All the animals were created complex, with incredible design. Things have been fine-tuned for life, not only to exist, but to flourish. Animals reproduce after their kind. The world around us bears a mark of a great global flood. Remember when you were in school, and some of you are there, the Pangea thing? I remember when I was in school way back, again, in the Stone Age. My kids like to tell me how old I am, but we would take the map of the world and we would cut all the continents out and we would piece them together and show in the Pangea. Well, there's very real. Psalm 104 gives us a really good explanation for how that happened when the flood happened. Mountains rose and valleys sank. The fountains of the deep were broke open. We look around us and we see the Scablands and the Badlands and the Grand Canyon. We see dinosaur graveyards all over the world. You're like, how can this happen? Because the flood of Noah's day happened. In Romans 1, 18 through 20, Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." It's been pointed out many times that it's not a head problem, it's a heart problem. It's not that we're not able to see and understand the evidence that God is there, that God is real, and the Bible is his inspired word. The evidence is all around us. The question is, do we want to see it? For me to see it, for me to accept it, for me to accept that God is real, that God is, that he created this world, means I'm not the boss of me anymore. That I don't control and I don't run my own life. That I have a creator who does. And that's a very inconvenient and uncomfortable truth for many people. Let's look at the second thing. That is the reality of morality. For just a moment, I'm going to ask you a question that I hope you say yes to. If you don't, we need to talk after services. Do you try to be a good person? Do you try to be a good person? Do you try to do the right thing? Do you try to treat people well? Practice justice? Unless you are a narcissistic person, and they do exist, or unless you're a psychopath, you probably say yes. We all struggle with it sometimes. I struggle with being nice to people sometimes. I struggle with being a good person sometimes. But I want to be good and I want to do good, and my question is why? Why be good? Why try to do what is right? What is good? What is right? What governs the way I treat you and you treat me? What defines what is moral? Every evolutionist would admit that there is right and there is wrong. Because if they don't, then walk up and slap them, steal their car, steal their keys and take their car, take their house from them. If there's not a right and wrong, then you do what you want to do. They admit that there's right and wrong. The question becomes, why is there right and wrong? And evolution doesn't really provide a good answer for this. Charles Darwin, in his autobiography, said, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a failure of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones." We talk about animals have instincts. Sometimes I get mad at my dog for chewing something up. He knows better, but at the end of the day, he's just being a dog, right? Well, you might. But if you're driving down one of these roads at night and a deer runs out in front of you, you don't get mad at the deer for running out in front of you. You might. But at the end of the day, what do we say? That deer was being a deer, especially if it's rut. Animals do what animals do. That's what Charles Darwin's saying here. We're just animals. Animals do what animals do. William Provine, another atheist, says humans and other animals make choices frequently, but these are determined by the interaction of heredity and environment and are not the result of free will. No inherent moral or ethical laws exist, nor are there absolute guiding principles for human society. The universe cares nothing for us, and we have no ultimate meaning in life. What a sad, terribly sad statement. But that's where evolution leaves you. Steven Weinberg, a professor at the Texas University, said, "I think that part of the historical mission of science has been to teach us we are not the playthings of supernatural intervention, that we can make our own way in the universe, and we have to find our own sense of morality." This is the world we live in, isn't it? We hear all the time, you have your truth and I have mine. Well, what's right for you may not be right for me. I can believe whatever I want to believe. That's the world we live in today. It is the result of the proliferation of evolution and the removal of God I believe especially from the classrooms, but from society in general. Lack of basis for morality creates a sticky mess for evolutionists. There we are. Charles Darwin said this. There's going to be some hard-to-hear things in the next few points. I'll warn you about that. But Darwin said, at some future period, not very distant, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. He's not talking about animals. He's talking about human beings. Civilized, taking out the uncivilized. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffenhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. It's Charles Darwin. Let me tell you, that's where evolution goes. Silverman versus Turek, a debate that happened, I think it was 2013, yeah. I'm not going to read all the debate, but Mr. Silverman responded to Turek this way. When Turek brought up the Nazis, Silverman said, that's the hard answer. The hard answer is you're correct. Hard answer is it is a matter of opinion. Hard answer is they thought they were doing objective good. They did, so we condemn them as a society, but you know we do this all the time. It's hard. It's hard to say that the Nazis were wrong. Really? You struggle with that? If you're an evolutionist, you do. Because you have no basis of morality. Muslim extremists. If we do not acknowledge some sort of external standard, what's to prevent us from saying the Muslim extremists aren't right? Randy Thornhill, and I'll just say assault against women. While he stood hard against it, makes the very point that it's kind of hard to condemn it. Because what it is men are acting like the animals that we really are. It's evolved from machinery for obtaining a higher number of mates in an environment where females choose mates. How do you condemn it? We're just animals. It is the natural conclusion of evolution. We've heard for years the two main engines behind evolution are natural selection and survival of the fittest. They talk about chemical things now and genetical things now, but natural selection, survival of the fittest, that is what we hear the most about. And we can observe these in our world around us. We can observe these happening. They say that some creatures have traits better suited for the environments than others. That's real. And that those traits are passed down to their offspring. And over time, those traits become more and more prominent across the population. The stronger individuals with better traits survive, and they propagate more than the weaker ones. We are only here today because our ancestors had what it took to survive. They were stronger, they were faster, and they were smarter. And the others didn't. And that included to the evolutionists the rise of morality. If natural selection and survival of the fittest explains it. And that is our go-to. And morality is just a byproduct of that. I have some questions. What about the poor, the less fortunate? What about the underprivileged, the elderly? Why be concerned at all with welfare since surviving and thriving for them isn't as important as it is for us? You reach a certain age in life, let's just extinguish you. You're taking up space and oxygen. Why not? For several years, I had a neighbor that lived across the street from me that I was quite jealous of at times. I struggled with it. He drove the fanciest car. He pulled up beside me the other day at a brand new Corvette, 2026, Z06. I'm like, whoo, that's fancy. I was driving a $1,500 Jeep. I love my Jeep, but $1,500 Jeep, and he's in this Corvette. And he rubbed shoulders with famous people. I got introduced to all sorts of really cool people. What's to stop you? If evolution is true, and it's about survival of the fittest, natural selection, what's to stop me from going in and just, I'm going to take your car. I'm going to take your house. I'm going to take your spouse. What do we see? I don't know how many of you enjoy hunting. I try to hunt. I'm not very good at it. But during rut, you see two buck come out and they will battle sometimes even to the death over that doe. Why not? If I'm stronger than you, if I'm faster than you, I'm smarter than you, then shouldn't I survive and shouldn't you be taken out of the gene pool? What makes us so different? It creates moral madness. I can lie, I can cheat, I can steal, I can even murder if it helps me survive. And I can argue from an evolutionary standpoint that those actions are good for humanity if I can pull it off. Their explanations, I'm going to skip over this for the sake of time, but they'll point to biological evolution, they'll point to social constructs, they'll point to neurological factors. But in all of this, when they go about trying to explain the presence of morality, all they can talk about is what is moral, not why it's moral. They look and they say, we need to do what's good for this culture and this society, and what's good for the Australians, and what's good for people in South Africa, and what's good for people in Venezuela. They need to do what's good for them. Their standard is theirs, ours is ours. But it's what's good for the population as a whole. But they can't explain how that works because there is no mechanism for it. Moral creatures do not arise from an amoral source. It doesn't work that way. There is morality because God is a moral God. He is righteous, He is just, He is good, and He is those things perfectly. It's more logical to say that we are designed by an intelligent creator who is perfectly moral himself than to think somehow that chemical reactions and neural impulses explain why we have a sense of right and wrong. We believe that we are made in the image and likeness of God. So we're not perplexed when we see morality around us. Genesis 9:6 says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Not just about murdering people, but James makes the application there to how we speak to and about people, our words, our talk. When we speak and we treat people, we do it knowing that they were made in the image of God like I was. That is a standard much bigger than myself. It's a standard that begins at the throne of God. And it is objective. If there is no objective standard of right and wrong, if there isn't a compass greater than the individual, morality really can't exist, but it does, which points to a creator and not evolution. One last point. We'll run through this as quick as I can. And that is the existence of information. If you're not asleep already, I can put you there if I read my notes. It gets deep. I am not an intelligent person, but I do like to read. And the more you read about DNA, the more mind-blown you can become. What makes you you? What is it that drives your ability to live? It's something that we cannot see with our eye. We have processes that happen at mind-blowing speeds. And science is beginning to learn and understand how all of this works. And it's impressive what goes on a molecular level inside of us. There's two basic molecules that result in life, proteins, nucleic acids. Yes, Elijah, you're back in the 7th grade classroom. DNA is composed of 4 nucleotide bases. They're abbreviated with the letters A, T, C, G. I'm going to spare you having to discuss them all. DNA, you'll recognize, is often pictured as a spiraling ladder, and these nucleotides, this DNA, is forming the rungs. DNA is the information that we need for life. How much information is there out there? A team of scientists fits 70 billion. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around. That's like our national debt. 70 billion copies of their genetics book, including page formatting instructions and images totaling 700 terabytes of data into just 1 gram of DNA. In the end, they printed billions of book copies in a fingernail-sized puddle of DNA. There is no material that has as much data storage density as DNA. The science report shows that DNA is 6 powers of 10 denser than flash drive technology. It is still mind-blowing to me that I can bring, I'm not going to unplug it because I don't want to crash the system, but I can bring a flash drive and I can put just boo-koodles of information on that flash drive. And music and videos and pictures and sermons and PowerPoints and all sorts of stuff can fit on that flash drive. And we got them now so that you pretty much never fill them up. Remember the day you used to have like stacks of them? We pretty much don't fill these up anymore. They're so big. And yet DNA holds so much more. DNA molecule contains the biological instructions that make each species unique, and that's important. We are unique. We have different DNA. It is passed on from adult organisms to their offspring during reproduction. This is me being gracious to you. So, for instance, if you look at the screen, you'll see some letters and some strands in there. The order and the sequence of the bases determines what biological instructions are contained in a strand of DNA. For example, the sequence ATCGTT might instruct for blue eyes, while ATCGCT might instruct for brown. The complete DNA instruction book or genome for a human contains about 3 billion bases and about 20,000 genes on 23 pairs of chromosomes. The unique structure of DNA allows it to even reproduce itself, which is crazy. Riding along the DNA is a protein called RNA polymerase. If it's not there, it doesn't unzip. Both sides of the DNA strand become separated. One side gets copied. The copy is called RNA. It's messenger RNA. It takes the copy and transports it to another place. It's mind-blowing. They said in the case of human DNA, it would stretch, if you printed it out on paper in regular size font, human DNA would stretch from the North Pole to the equator using standard letter sizes. That's pretty wild to think about. Richard Dawkins noted the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Software developer Bill Gates has noted DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we have ever created. It's a problem for evolution. They recognize a couple of quotes. We're almost done. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. That is Charles Darwin in The Origin of the Species. He's saying if there is irreducible complexity, it's been illustrated many times with a mousetrap. Take one piece off of a mousetrap and what happens? It don't work, does it? So you've got to have all of these parts working together the way they do in order for it to function and exist correctly. Darwin says if you find that, then his theory comes completely unraveled. Well, evolutionist Dr. Carl Haskins said, did the code and the means of translating appear simultaneously in evolution? It seems almost incredible that any coincidences could have occurred. Given the extraordinary complexity of both sides, the requirement they be coordinated accurately for survival. By a pre-Darwinian, this puzzle surely would have been interpreted as the most powerful sort of evidence for special creation. In other words, the evidence points to God and not toward evolution. Natural selection absolutely has to have something to select from. It will not work on the cell, because if you start without the parts, you start without life. I thought I was running out of time. I didn't, but I thought I was running out of time. I started to get a bunch of Scrabble tiles and put them in a big box and shake them up and set them down and see if they spell out a word even, much less a sentence. And then shake it up again. And we could sit here all night and we could shake up those Scrabble tiles. Are we going to get a complete sentence? No, it ain't going to happen, is it? And that's kind of like what you think about when you start thinking about evolution, but it goes a step beyond that. Because if I shake up a box full of Scrabble tiles, I'm shaking up letters that are already there. The problem with evolution is it doesn't have information to start with. Non-information does not create information, and they have no good explanation for how that came to be. Evolution does not explain the presence of the information we have in our system. It may adapt it, but you're playing with what God has already created. DNA contains the code. It takes many proteins to transcribe and translate the code to build proteins. Proteins themselves are coded in DNA. To produce these proteins from the code requires the proteins themselves. Which came first? That was Dr. Buddy Payne. Some of you will recognize that name. Which came first? For those who believe in God, the presence of complex and irreducible information is not problematic. To me, it is a beautiful expectation. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. The story of the Bible opens up with the giving of information. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And our bodies are filled with information. For us to exist, our cells require some amazing and mind-blowing design features. It is detailed, it is specific, and it is specialized. And the design looks like it was made that way on purpose. Random chance does not produce it. The Bible declares we have a Creator who is infinitely wise, knowledgeable, and creative. Isaiah 45:11. Thus says the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and the one who formed him. Ask me of things to come. Will you command me concerning my children and the work of my hands? I made the earth. I created man on it. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens, and I commanded all their host. For thus says the Lord who created the heavens. Verse 18, He is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. Fine-tuning of the universe is biblical, isn't it? I am the Lord. There is no other. I want to encourage you to take time being amazed by God. God is so wise. I am guessing some of you live very busy lives. Some of you may be retired and maybe life has slowed down a little bit, but some of you live very busy lives. I got 5 kids. I basically work 3 jobs. One of them doesn't even pay anything. That might be the most demanding sometimes. But 5 kids and 3 jobs, my life is go, 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 go. Right before church, my phone was blowing up because of one of them. We're busy. How many times you go through a day and you don't stop to notice the world around you? Walk outside and stare at the skies. Step into the woods and roll over a dead trunk and look at the whole world that's occurring underneath it. Spend time thinking about how awesome this world is. And us, the crowning jewels of God's creation. And I say all that, and I read this verse for this reason. God is wise. And we can trust His will, and we can trust His way no matter what. When I lean on my own understanding, I make a big mess of everything. I need to lean on God, and I need to trust Him. There are so many people that go through this world today. They don't know why they're here, and they don't know where they're going. We use the term lost. It's a good description. They are lost as they can be. You know, there's no reason to be that way. You've got design. You've got purpose, just like the world around us does. If God made all these plants and these animals, God made the sun, the moon, and the stars with such incredible design, with purpose, on purpose, the same is true for you, but on a greater level. Don't wander through this world lost. We're going to sing, Prepare to Meet Thy God. Out of habit, I look backwards. But prepare to meet thy God. It is a scary thing if our lives are not right with Him, to think of standing before the Lord. And people don't like to talk about being afraid of God, but if my life ain't right with God, I need to be afraid of God. That's a healthy fear. We don't need to live in that kind of fear, though. We can give our lives to God. We can prepare to meet Him, and it can be a beautiful thing. At the end of the day, this world, all that it offers you, it ain't nothing. What do you do when the doctor walks in the room and says, I'm sorry, it's cancer? Or you get one of those knocks on your door in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, that's part of what I do with one of my jobs. Deliver bad news at the worst times. What do you do? What do you do when you lose your job, or you lose somebody you love, or life begins to come unraveled all around you? All of a sudden, you've got to have something to hold on to. The evolutionists we talked about tonight, there ain't nothing. You live and you die, and you're like Rover, you're dead all over. There ain't nothing to hold on to. God will give you something bigger than this moment. And if you don't have it, I don't know how you get through the day. Come to God. Give him your life. If you believe in Jesus, will you turn away from this world, turn away from sin? I would even say turn away from yourself and give your life to him. Confess him. Be buried with him in baptism, raised to walk and new life. Beautiful thing about God as a creator is he's also great at recreating. Let him recreate you. If we can help you with that or anything, just come to the front while we stand and sing.